every once in a while, someone will drop a comment on the Facebook page or reply to a tweet or something on Instagram, and they'll say something usually that's directed to the guest. Your story resonated with me in the following way. This sounded a lot like my story. And every once in a while, they're directed at me, and the comment will say something along the lines of, I'm so glad I found this podcast, or I can't believe I didn't find this podcast before, or now I have another one to add to my adoptee podcast list. And that is definitely the kind of energy that keeps me going, because there are definitely times when, life gets busy. I'm chasing my dog, my son, trying to do my day job. I've got other things that I'm focused on, my marriage. There's a lot going on. And I don't mean to be flip about this, but I don't have to do this. I choose to, but I'm motivated because it feels like a platform that is allowing voices to come forward in an open, honest way, very raw, without judgment. And it's allowing folks to see pieces of themselves in other people's stories. And so it becomes incredibly motivational to me to just keep going. But I have realized I can't go on and on and on forever. So I started to take breaks. So now my show is seasonal. I'll do a bunch of shows in the spring, take summer off. I'll do a bunch of shows in the fall and take winter off. That gives my mind time to refresh. It gives me an opportunity to focus on some of the other things I should be doing. So, I don't want to say it's a fun project, but it's really fulfilling, I think is the right way to put it.
Yeah. And I thought your podcast was interesting because it's specifically focused on birth search and reunion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sounds like a narrow topic, but having listened to a lot of your episodes, even all of those episodes, they vary so much from each other. Are there some recurring themes you think that have come up more frequently than others, or like what have you noticed?
Certainly, there's a lot of commonality between adoptee stories. I find one piece is pretty obvious: is I have been in this place of understanding what adoption meant, but not really sort of totally grasping it until something happened. I had a medical event, I had a child of my own, or I've always wanted to search, and there's that concept of sort of coming out of the fog. There's a lot of people who conceptually understand what it means that an infant or a child or whomever is taken from one family and placed into another, but there's this moment where I think people really realize it, that, wait, I actually have a different family out there. I am biologically related to someone else. So the one common theme is this sort of coming out of the fog moment that a lot of people have. And I had it myself. And part of that coming out of the fog for me was being on the podcast, because I got to hear all of these other stories from people. And I was just like, man, this is a wild institution with a variety of different inputs and outputs. I think another common theme is the starvation for medical history. If I have a 12-year-old son downstairs, and before any reunion and any conversation with my biological mother or my biological father, I could not have told any physician anything about my medical history. And of course, that's incredibly valuable information for him and his future children. And I think finally, the third thing I'll say is there's a lot of folks out there who are interested in searching, who some don't know where to start. They're hungry for it. Some search and then they stop, and they search and they stop. Life gets in the way. So I guess the third theme is really that there's probably more folks out there who are interested or would like to search than we actually realize. There's several of us in Facebook groups. There's several of us listening to podcasts. There's several of us over here, there, and everywhere in different support groups. I think that's probably only a fraction of the people who are actually interested in knowing more about themselves and may not even be in a position of having come out of the fog and being ready to admit it to themselves. So just a couple of high-level themes that I've seen so far.
Damon, we're getting a couple of audience comments. One saying that Damon's podcast was the first one I found and started listening to. It really helped me a great deal through my search for my birth family. And another one was I am thankful for you, Damon. I have been searching for resources my whole life, and I feel
Oh
connected when I
man,
listen to your podcast.
that's the
So
stuff that keeps me going right there. I'm not even kidding you. Like there are days when you just go, man, I don't feel like doing another audio edit. I host and produce the whole show, but it's stuff like that that keeps me going. So thank you guys so much, and I'm really glad that you've found and taken something from the show, because it really is about you and the guests. It's not about me.
let's switch over to um, Maya and Amy for a moment, and I have a couple questions for you. You had the second excerpt in our three audios there. So you're a relatively new podcast, but you really had a huge, I think, opening. You had 19 episodes in about 3 months, which is an incredible volume. Is that kind of
Yeah.
what you wanted? Was that all planned, or does it just kind of happen organically?
It was actually really lucky because I think the podcast we started making episodes just as lockdown occurred in most countries. And so it's actually really nice, ironically, because it helped, it freed up a lot of time for us to like get together and organize the podcast and also to bring on other adoptees. So I think that really helped to our lots of episodes at the beginning. And I think hopefully because we do have three hosts, we have the advantage of like if one host is maybe not available, we still have two other hosts and they can still try and create an episode. Uh, so we do have, so hopefully we can continue to make our one episode per week goal continue, but I think that over time we probably will lose some steam and we'll probably switch to like maybe seasonal as Damon is doing right now, which is a great idea.
Were there, and Maya, you can, Amy, you can feel free to jump in any time, but were there any like unexpected challenges that came up? So you had this idea, the COVID, like some things kind of worked out well for you. Was there anything that threw you off, but you had to adjust to?
Yeah, definitely. I think just even getting off the ground, when Maya posted back in November, it was kind of like when you're a freshman in college and you go to that activity fair. A lot of people have interest and they all want to sign up, but then, real life starts to settle in and people start dropping off. So just even getting the podcast to become a thing, honestly, I was, by the time December hit around, I was like, this probably is going to happen. That would have been really cool though. And then the lockdown happened. Maya had reached out to us again, and we went from like the first call we ever had was about 15 people, and now it's down to 3. So that was just a really big struggle. And then we're all relatively young. We're all, not even somebody wasn't even 20, and then I'm in the low 20s. So just the idea of how do we make a podcast was a really big challenge that we just, we saw people online doing it all the time, but the actual work that goes in, it was a really big and steep learning curve. Just how do we edit? How do we record? How do we do all of the things that need to go into making content consistently? So finding that rhythm, finding that focus was a really big challenge that we just, we're young. We're like, let's make a podcast, let's share our voice. And then we encountered, the real life, but it was definitely worth pushing through.
Yeah, great. And I think the energy of your episodes really show. One thing I found kind of a little bit distinct about your episodes was that you'll have, say, a guest on, and it won't be it won't really be an interview. There'll be like a topic, but it'll be very conversational. It'll be just like this is a kind of a co-host today, and we're all talking together, and we're all friends here, and it has kind of like a coffee chat kind of feel to it, which I thought was great. Is that part of kind of how you envisioned it?
Yeah, I think we liked having, originally was more like an interview, but as we made more episodes, we kind of just liked like letting the conversation go where it went. And it's really nice because sometimes, we had these discussion questions, but then someone would bring up some like really cool backstory or something, and they're like, oh, well, we have to follow through with this. And so definitely having the conversation flow gave us that freedom to just follow where people talk.
Yeah, yeah, cool. So I know like a lot of the Chinese adoptees that I know, the Chinese adoptive community tends to be heavily involved with the parents. Are you finding you're getting a lot of parent listeners? Are you getting feedback from them? I was just curious whether you're getting any interaction on that level.
We haven't really heard from other people's parents. We kind of, like in our intro, we
Yeah.
kind of say made by Asian adoptees for Asian adoptees. Not to say any APs out there can't listen, but actually I made the decision to tell my parents about the podcast, and that's kind of opened up a lot of doors. So maybe I'm just really lucky that my parents are interested, but they're coming to me after the episodes and they're asking more questions and they're doing follow-ups, and they're even saying, I'm so sorry, I never knew the things that you were feeling and going through. I never thought that this would be so impactful in your life. So I'm hoping that other APs out there are listening and thinking about those things, because it's really, in my personal sphere, my APs are really reciprocal and really involved. So I'm hoping it's being well received by others.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. Maya, did you have any, I'm just curious whether you had any reaction with your family?
I'm actually not as close with my family on
Okay.
the adoptive spectrum, so
Yeah.
no, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah. And so where do you feel like, now that you've done the podcast a little bit, do you feel like you might change a little as you move forward? Like one thing you mentioned was maybe moving to a seasons kind of thing. Just curious whether you have, now that you've learned something, how you might see it evolving a little bit.
So that, Amy?
Yeah.
It's definitely something that we'll probably be talking about. We've been finding now that, states are opening up again and jobs are going back in person. It's been a lot more difficult to nail down a time that 3 hosts can meet to coordinate future episodes. So we'll definitely be putting that on our next discussion, I assume.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that. Kiyomi, let's jump over to you just for a few questions. And you're definitely one of the first podcasts that I had listened to. I was just curious, what kind of got you going? What was the reason that you got this started?
Well, it started again because I was interested in going to Korea to live myself as an adult, and
Right.
wanting to hear about other stories, and just fascinated about what that experience is like for adoptees who go back and choose to go back and live and experience what life is like in Korea on their own terms.
Yeah.
But I think what keeps me going is the podcast. It's just really, it's something that has actually been, I think, really healing for people who share their stories. I think there is, obviously it's kind of scary, and some people are more prepared to open up about their experiences than others. And some people are more selective about what they want to share. But I think, I always hear back that for the majority of folks who I've interviewed or have had on the podcast, that it actually ends up being a really a healing experience for them to share their stories in such a public way. And it just goes out into the ether. And I think that, also as I come from a journalist background, I'm a reporter. So it's kind of a natural fit for me to start a podcast. But I think I also find, like, working on the podcast, and all of us here who are podcasters, we end up devoting a lot of time to this endeavor. And I find that it's also helped in my own processing by hearing each story, by making me think about how I may relate to it, how their experience might be really different from mine. It's opened up my ideas of, and my thoughts about adoption, and hearing the different, viewpoints and experiences. And I think when I first started my podcast, I really thought that I would encounter more adoptees who would have similar stories to mine. And I think that we probably all can attest to the fact that once you start talking to people, you realize that the stories are so varied, even though we all kind of have these commonalities and common experiences, that where you grew up, what country, what is the makeup of your family. I mean, all these little distinct details really create, and then our own personalities, it really creates for these really rich stories. And so, I never run out of, I always am inspired by each story. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
I find that having listened to a lot of your episodes, one of the major, I think, recurring themes is around language. For example, one thing I learned was around, I found your interview with Kim Stoker was really fascinating because she talked about why she lived in Korea for many years, but purposefully did not learn Korean, which before I had heard that interview, I had thought that would have been like a really crazy thing to do. But I really came to understand her point of view about coming back as an adoptee. And do you like, I know you're doing, and then so you're also doing this Kickstarter where you are now trying to translate back some of your episodes to Korean language. What's the importance of that to you? Like, what does that represent for you?
Yeah, well, I recently was able to raise enough money to start translations of one season. I just thought we would start with that and to see what kind of impact it could have. But also, all of these stories talking about our experiences and um, it's adoptee to adoptee, which I think really creates much more intimacy in what we share. And, I think as an adoptee, you may talk about adoption or go into more detail with other adoptees than you might with non-adopted friends, family. And even I hear back that adoptees say that, oh my gosh, my family or my friends learned so much about me after I went on your podcast that they didn't know before. And so I think it's really rich having these conversations between adoptees, and you can become like a fly on the wall for others. But one of the things that I realized was that these stories would be really, I think, have an impact if Koreans could understand them. And they're just not accessible in English. And, just from my own experience of being in Korea, that a lot of, like your average everyday Korean didn't know much about adoptees. It usually ended, if you mentioned you were an adoptee or they realized you were, they quickly would change the subject or go silent, or things would become awkward. And just having these kind of reactions, I realized that there's just not a lot of awareness and education and people even talking about adoption because there is such a stigma. And this is a theme that has recurred in the interviews that I've done where, it's often where people will talk about going back to Korea for the first time since their adoption. And, just about all the experiences and the reactions to Koreans to them. And I've just heard that as a recurring theme, that there's just a lot of, I think, there's not a lot of awareness and misunderstanding, or there's, in the media, there's, portrayals that are not quite accurate. And so the point of the Kickstarter was, my hope is that these stories will be in text. They won't be, it's not a separate podcast in Korean, but through text, at least, I'm hoping that these stories will become accessible to Koreans so they can better understand us. So that's the point of the translation.
Yeah, thank you. And so that was a successful Kickstarter, I take it?
Yeah, we raised the money. We've already started. The translator
Oh, wow.
in Korean has already started to work on some of the episodes. And so the stories will be in text, and it's based on, if obviously, the permission of the adoptee, because it's very interesting about language because actually, one adoptee doesn't want it translated back because she is in reunion and doesn't want there's some thoughts from her experience that she doesn't want to share. And I find it really interesting that the barrier of language is kind of, it's almost, we say that we want, that the language barrier, the lack of language is a barrier. But sometimes I think that if given the possibilities, I think some of us would choose not to be able to have our Korean family, or even, I suppose mostly Korean family, access some of these feelings. So we can use the fact that we're of a different culture, we were raised, with a different language, that we can use that sometimes to our advantage to
Right.
Withhold some things. And I find that really interesting, that both sides, that the language is really an interesting element to reunion.
It can be a challenge, but also you can use it, you're saying, kind of for your own, as an
Yeah.
empowering aspect.
Well, right, because there's so much, especially when you're in reunion, and I'm not, but if you're in reunion, that people say that there's this, I think there's a struggle, because they realize, because of language, because of culture, because of time, that there's aspects of the relationship that they can never recover. They can never, in reunion, and language being a major part of it. And yet I find it interesting that if you are able to break down some of these barriers, that, perhaps these barriers protect us both, protect the parents, protect us. I find that really, that's kind of been a recent observation that I've had.
Right, that is interesting. So I'm gonna have a final question for the participants, but also if you have a question or you'd just like to make a comment during the Q&A or introduce your own podcast, or have any, whatever you want to say, if you would please chat to Sarah Crane Diedrich, and she will just confirm you're on the registration list. So, and then we'll jump into the Q&A next. I just want to jump back to Damon for a minute. Damon, I know a lot of in particularly New York State recently, have changed their original birth certificate laws.
Yeah.
Is that having a big impact on people doing searches, being successful in searches? Are you seeing a lot of that?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think that opening does is it also sends signals to other states, right? New York was notorious for being locked down, and it was a source of massive frustration for a great many people. I think my second guest on the show, Laura, tells the story of, having walked past the records room that probably had her adoption record in it, and there was never any opportunity to get any information about it. But I have noticed a significant uptick in the number of people on the show who've said something about having been from New York, having, the recent law change and the increase in access to people's records. So, but I think it does a lot of things. It also offers encouragement to people who feel like they're going to be stuck forever, to see that a state like New York will say, you know what, I think we need to change our minds and make a different, take a different tack on how it is that we keep these records locked down. And I think it humanizes the issue, right? At one point when everything is locked down, it could be seen as, just the piece of paper and the stuff that's on it. And it may have been seen as a privacy issue for the, biological or natural parents that were, for all intents and purposes, being protected, as well as the infant or child who was being de-identified and placed somewhere else. I think by opening these records up, it offers a truth to the people who are seeking those records and makes us, human again, and not just some, almost, and I don't want to make it sound awful, but like commodity that was traded from one place to another and is in locked documents. So I'm hopeful that more states will do something along those lines, because as you know, there's a variety of different laws on the books for different states. And I think it's just, it's really too bad, because I was able to get my information and it just opened things up so super quickly. And I feel for those who can't do the same thing.
Yeah. So I also feel like locked birth certificate sends a message that the former life, your first family is like a secret, and that whole life should be a secret and should be kind of forgotten. And
Yeah.
it has that overtone to it.
The other thing that it offers is, so in my case, I was born in October and I was adopted, say officially 3 months later. I was taken home 3 months later. There was a time where I lived with some person that I don't know. I had a name that I don't identify with today.
Mm-hmm.
There's a transitional period between the time that I was brought onto this earth and the time that I was brought into my family that I can't account for. It's almost, I mean, if I was an adult, it would be the equivalent of being in a multi-month coma, right? I don't have any identity or any idea what was happening in my life at that time. And I think that that's a real tragedy. And for someone to at least be able to see some level of documentation that says what their prior name was, perhaps something more about the city, state, and zip they were born in, and information about, even if it's de-identified, the parents who brought them into this world. I think it's really powerful. And this is something that I think is interesting about these podcasts is, someone said earlier, I think it was Amy, she was talking about being on this podcast and offering up guests gives you an opportunity for others to hear what is impactful to you as an adoptee. I can speak to each one of these podcasters here easily because I know they're adoptees. It's not going to be as easily received or understood by someone who's not an adoptee. And therefore the conversation is very different. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity that our shows offer to folks to hear what the possibilities are, what the challenges are, what our inner thoughts are, that can be very affirming in ways that I think are sort of underestimated by folks who are non-adoptees. So there's a lot to be said for the opening of the laws and the records. I want to go back to one quick thing, if you don't mind, please, Mike. I wanted to say there's a couple of things that Kaomi also said, that it's healing to open up. A lot of times when the guests come on the show, they're nervous. And it's because a lot of times they haven't actually told their entire story to anybody before. Nobody. And I think what's unique about what we offer as podcasters who are adoptees is we are an empathetic ear who understands at least a piece of what they've gone through. We're a trustworthy source of sharing the truth. And I think that it lends a lot of catharsis to folks. I've ended multiple calls, and you won't necessarily hear it on the show, but folks will say things like, man, it was really good to talk to you. I've never told anybody my whole story before. And I think that it can be very healing and incredibly powerful. And I think that's kind of a piece of the power that some of the audience takes away, is that open rawness that someone shares as a part of their story is just incredible. Another piece that Kaomi also brought up was the distinctive details that separate us all. As I look at this panel, I'm a male, I'm Black, I'm looking at Asian adoptees and females. And so we're all very different. And any one of us could have been adopted into a family of color, a white family, whatever the thing is. I could have been brought up in the Midwest or in England, like whatever. And all of those different details, not to mention the pieces of our own personalities that make us distinctive and individuals, make all of our stories so drastically different. I just find that sort of lens through which to see things, that if I took one adoptee and picked them up and planted them in a different country, a different family, a different religion, with a different, whatever the cultural norms are, their story would be drastically different. And that's not something that you will get with a child who is born and stays with their natural parents. So I think this is part of what I find fascinating about all of the podcast episodes that we all do, is any one of these stories could have been drastically different with just, the flip of a butterfly's wing to change everything into the future. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, great insights. Thank you. I agree with you, and I would say more, but I just end up saying what you said. So, but great insights. I want to have one question here for Maya and Amy. One of the episodes, I felt that just one of your more, I think, just really emotional episodes was on the One Child Nation policy. It was actually a One Child Nation, the movie, the documentary, kind of discussing that. And I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but just how that maybe that movie might have affected your community or affected you personally. That I just found that episode had just a lot of emotion from all the panelists who are, all the people who were on the show, and it's really just I learned so much from all of you in that episode.
Yeah, for sure. So the documentary that Mike's referring to is the One Child Nation, which was, I think, released maybe a couple of years ago. And it was really eye-opening, especially for a lot of Chinese adoptees, because it goes into depth about how the policy was put into place. And it's through the stories of people like the midwives who had to perform the abortions and people who lost their children. And there's just so much with that documentary. It's a must see if you are a Chinese adoptee or you know someone who's adopted from China, because it just I don't know where to start. Maybe Amy can help me out. But definitely, if you watch it, I recommend having someone there with you, because it is a very emotional film and it really pulls at your heartstrings, and it's very, very sad because so one of the scenes that pops into my head is there's a photographer that's interviewed, and what he did was he was originally just taking pictures of trash under a bridge in China, and then he kept on coming across human fetuses, and just something about like the imagery of that, and realizing that that could have been me. Like, it was just a very heartbreaking and powerful moment.
I think so one of the things that before I fully came to term with my adoption journey, and of course we're all kind of still on that path, but one of the moments that kind of really touched a place that I wasn't quite ready to go was when I was in college. My professor told me I was lucky that I wasn't drowned and in a room full of people, and that was not something that I was ready to hear, but it was something that as a Chinese adoptee we need to eventually come to terms with. Like, the background and the circumstances of why we were adopted are vastly different than a lot of other adoptee stories. And if you've never watched a documentary, it talks about how the One Child Nation policy forced families who didn't want to give up their children to do that. It forced families to either have to abort their children or abort right after they were born. It also had a lot of families that, they were told that their child died in childbirth, and realistically, they were taken away to an orphanage. And it also talked about how people were essentially, in an effort to stop seeing so many, I'm sorry, this is a little graphic and a little upsetting, but in order to stop seeing all these, dead or dying Chinese children, just babies left in wet markets, left on the street, left anywhere, people would take those babies off the side of the road, bring them to orphanages and sell them. So it kind of forces a lot of Chinese adoptees to really confront the harsh realities of where we're from. And it just adds that layer of, we have this adoption story that our adopted families told us. And a lot of us, they're very similar. I was found at a police station. I was found a place that was safe, and they took me to the orphanage, and it was smooth sailing from there. But watching this documentary, we come to learn that that's not the case. It comes to light that a lot of our origin stories are false. They were made up narratives. And to have, the few things that you have from what Damon said about your former life, or that piece that was accounted for, to have that realization and to have to confront the idea that even those few things are most likely a lie, it's really hard, I think.
Yeah.
So like Maya said, it's an important documentary, and it's something that if you're a Chinese adoptee, I hope one day you have the strength to watch it, because it's hard. And if you love a Chinese adoptee, you should watch it as well, because these are the not to sound dramatic, but these are the darknesses of where we're from that we all have to kind of one day hopefully find solace and find a healing phase from that, because I remember one time my friend who's also adopted, she was talking about, finding her birth family again, because I recently have been looking and starting that search. And she asked me, oh, is it an open or closed adoption? And it was kind of one of those things that as a Chinese adoptee, that's just not the thing. That's just not ever going to be a thing, at least in the time that I was adopted. So it was,
Yeah.
For sure. I also just wanted to add one more thing about the documentary, which is that I think since it might be 2014, China has implemented now the two-child policy. And so one thing that I really liked about this documentary was that it wanted to make sure that the effects of the one-child policy weren't just brushed under the rug, because the Chinese government would not, and probably will not in the future, acknowledge damage that this policy created for millions and millions of lives of people. And so I really liked that this documentary tried to bring awareness and brought all kinds of voices so that there was more of an understanding of the situation, because I know a lot of it's kind of hidden, behind doors. So yeah.
Yeah, I was definitely felt the power of that documentary, and one of my big takeaways, which I'd be happy to talk about with you later because I don't want to get into it now, but is I think there will be at some point a very large wave of Chinese adoptee reunions. That's just kind of my personal prediction, but that was one of my big takeaways from that movie. Kiyomi, we do have one question from anonymously submitted that I'll just raise to you. And I'm not sure if you feel qualified to answer this, but certainly you may have some opinions on it. So the anonymous question was, having lived in Korea, how do you think that the 2012 special adoption law impacted adoptees' abilities to access their files? And do you think adoptee activism there has hindered or improved the birth search?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm really qualified to go into that, and I'm not, I moved
That's
back
fine.
in 2017, but I will say that there has been some improvements, but also, there's been still struggles. The 2012 special adoption law that was enacted, it's still problematic, and so that's why there's still efforts to reform it further. One of the loopholes, from what I understand, is that it leaves the language leaves it open to interpretation, which adoption agencies are interpreting it in a way that's least helpful to adoptees who are doing a search. So there's definitely still challenges. I know there's still, there's activism happening in Korea. It's difficult because so many people leave, and so even though there are some folks who have been there more long term, but there's also a revolving door. So sometimes people are more engaged in the activism, and then there's a burnout rate too, and sometimes there's kind of a changing of folks. So
I guess the question around the activism is about whether you think that helps in the society, like, whether it's, because they're pushing for change, and are they an actual agent for change, do you think, as far as Korean society is concerned, or do you feel like maybe people are reacting to them negatively? Not that they should stop their activism, regardless, but I think that's what maybe they're trying to, what your opinion is on that.
whether how adoptee activism in Korea is being perceived by Korean citizens?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that I can't.
Yeah, okay. That's fine. I know we have some other podcasters in the audience, so if you would like to just raise your hand and introduce your podcast, we'd love to have you do that. Just please reach out to Sarah. Meanwhile, we have a question from Sean So, and so let me try to find you, Sean. Sorry. And just let you turn off your, so you can ask your question. This is not working good for me. Okay. And you can, obviously anybody can ask their question anonymously or just through chat, or you can ask it directly. So Sean, if you want to turn on your video and just ask your question, is fine. And you might be on mute, I'm not sure.
Sorry, I'm back. Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you. You want to ask your question?
Thanks. This question to anyone who would like to respond. I assume some adoptee episodes might bring up some relatables. I was just wondering if anyone would like to share any advice of how they manage their own well-being while working on these podcasts.
So anyone on the
Sorry, I'll jump in.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't hear the question clearly. Would you mind just restating, Sean?
Yeah, sorry, I'm having a few connection issues. I was just saying that I assume working on these podcasts and discussing the issues you discussed, they might bring up some relatable issues you might have experienced yourselves or could relate to. I was just curious to see if you could share any advice on how you manage your own well-being while working on these episodes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna go ahead and start. I'll be honest with you. I just go ahead and cry with my guests. I laugh with them. Like, I want them to feel comfortable, and I don't want them to feel judged. And so I just get into the story with them as much as they're in it. And I think that they take a lot of healing from, as I've said, and as has been agreed by others, from just openly speaking about the thing. And I think it's almost therapeutic in a bi-directional way with both of us, because the same way that I've learned something here from each one of our panelists, I learned something from each one of my guests as well. And I'll go away and I'll tell friends about incredible stories that I've heard on the show. I've got a friend in the chat right now, and I've told her about some of the amazing stories that I've heard, because it helps me to sort of get it off my chest and not just sort of own it and keep it in here, but also to just continue to talk about it, because the same way they're talking about their story, I need to talk about their story to sort of flesh it out and let it go. And but what's interesting, Sean, is I was just thinking about this the other day. I was on a plane back from California, and I was editing a show, and it was a show that I recorded probably at the beginning of the summer. And I remember how emotional this show was, and I cried with the guy when we did it, and I cried again as I was editing the thing. It's just really crazy to think that, you know, these things can be so impactful, that they're as emotional as they are. And I've had some guests make comments. Listen, I've listened to several of your podcast episodes more than once. So I think it helps for us, at least for me, to continue to talk about it the same way that the adoptee does.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I did wonder, because you obviously go through the experience of recording with them at the time, but then you actually have to come back to that and edit it, and then probably listen to it all the way through. So you're covering it a few times.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Thanks.
Kaomi, did you want to have any comment?
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that I wrote down that I wanted to mention, is that one thing I didn't realize getting into podcasting about our stories is the emotional labor that goes into being on the other end. And I think sometimes we think that all the labor is on the part of the adoptee who's telling their story, and certainly they're bearing a lot of it. But it's almost like, a friend put it to me that, you know, she said, you're almost like an empath, where you're listening and taking in all the emotion and being very empathetic. You know, to listen well is to be empathetic, and it also it can trigger all your own personal issues you have as well. And so, you know, at the same time, the way I conduct my podcast is I try not to bring too much of my story into theirs. But it's definitely impacts me as I'm listening. And when I talk about emotional labor, it's actually, it can be very exhausting. I personally find that I tried to do this summer where I was trying to do a bunch of interviews over the summer and just kind of store them up. And that's somewhat successful in that, I mean, yes, I was able to kind of, I was able to build up kind of these stories in advance, and then I can go back and produce them, when the timing's right for me. But it's also, I've scheduled like 2 interviews in one day, and it's actually really exhausting. And I realized that's probably not a good idea, because it's not like just sitting down and, asking about politics or how someone feels about, obviously the weather or their job or their industry, but it's very deeply personal. And, I don't know how you don't get personally involved emotionally when people are inviting you into their stories, things they've never told even some of their closest friends and family. But somehow they feel safe to tell you. And that's an incredible responsibility. That's an incredible privilege. But it's also, you have to also monitor your own health and well-being. And so I recommend not doing 2 interviews in one day.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tara is here, who has a podcast. She just wanted to say hello. So Tara, please.
Hi. I actually just discovered this group yesterday through like somebody who's a part of the organization. My podcast is Adopted Babies from China. So the focus is on Chinese adoptees, but it's really cool to hear from other adoptee podcasts as well. And I came in late and I kind of have a question, and I don't know if it was being addressed when I arrived.
Sure, go ahead.
I guess those who are podcast creators and hosts, do you monetize? Like, do you have sponsorships for your podcasts? Or if you don't, was there a particular time when you decided to start sponsorships or monetize as well? And I do think I came in and somebody was talking a little bit about monetizing, but I don't know the context. So apologies if that's a repeat.
For somewhere between, we don't have any kind of revenue stream. Actually, I like to say I'm the $30 in the red because I bought a microphone for it. So we just kind of make podcasts. We just really, because Chinese adoptees are, even though there was a wide range, we're really kind of coming up and finding our voices. So we didn't really think about how can we make money? How can we do this? We try to do as many find as many services for free that we can take advantage of. And then we just kind of do that.
Damon has a whole kind of marketing thing going there, Damon. Got a shirt. I see the shirt.
Yeah, but I tell you what I did was I took my logo from my show and I went to threadless.com and I put it on a shirt and ordered it for myself. And so it's available if you wanted to get it. But I actively chose not to try to monetize per se. This isn't for profit for me. This is a labor of love. And I elected very early on to not try to seek out sponsorships. I think about it every once in a while. I hear all these other podcasts that I enjoy and they swoop in with all of these spots and I know they're getting paid for it, but I feel like what I'm offering, and I think you guys may also, like, we're offering a delicate subject, and I don't want to just insert a mattress commercial in the middle of it. So what I've elected to do is sort of appeal to the listeners and make it a listener-supported show with my own support, because this is supposed to be a valuable resource for folks to feel something from each other as a community. And like I said, it's a labor of love, and it didn't feel like something that I wanted to try to profit from. So I've purposely not taken on monetization. That's my personal choice. But I've also made a personal choice to appeal a little more heavily to the listener base to say, this, as Kaomi said, this is an emotional roller coaster. As Amy and Maya have said, this is this takes time to get people together to do this and schedule it. So it's not lost on me that this isn't something that, I can just easily pick up and do, and it's effortless. It takes time. So I've begun to appeal a little bit more to the listener base to say, hey, listen, if you're taking some value for this, think about it like buying me a cup of coffee. And, so I'll plug it now. Go to patreon.com/WAI really, and, send me $3 and it'll be worth it, because that is also something that helps me keep going, is seeing folks say, you know what, I find value in your show. I can slip you $3 to $5 a month if you'll keep going for me. And I think that's fantastic.
Thank you. We had a question from Daryl Watson. This is maybe the best question is for the somewhere between hosts. He wants to know any advice about starting a podcast, and you've done that very recently.
Well, definitely invest in a good microphone, because no one wants to listen to crappy quality. So yeah. And definitely do your podcast hosting, because you have to host, in order to host a podcast, you have to have a podcast hosting website, so you have an RSS feed. And most websites do not offer that for free, but we were really lucky because we obviously aren't making any money. So we had to find a free website. And so we actually use sounder.fm. So if that is something you don't want to put money into, we've found that's been pretty reliable. And when we've had some difficulties with it, the customer service has been great. So definitely check them out. And then the process to apply for Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Play are pretty straightforward. Sounder actually offers a tutorial to do that, so that's also really helpful.
Any other comments for anybody?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Oh yeah, sorry. Trying to think. We record all of our episodes via Discord. I'm a very big video game person, so it's my go-to for pretty much everything. But we found a bot that comes in, records all of our tracks individually, and then Maya, the editing goddess that she is, can piece it all together, generate silence if my cat knocks something off the table. So that's a really great tool as well. Yeah.
Yes. Oh yeah, I would definitely recommend using Audacity for your audio editing. I think it's pretty user friendly. I'm sure there's other equally good ones, maybe better, but I'm not tech savvy enough to use them.
We're going to go to Alora next, who has a question.
Laura and sorry, I'm driving in my car, but I'm also being safe. And
yeah, Laura, you're not coming in very well.
All right, let me
Sorry to
hold
say.
on.
We'll come back to you in a minute. We'll come back to you in 1 minute. There was an anonymous question. Let me give this to Kiyomi while we're waiting. Kiyomi, again, this may be a question that you may not feel qualified to answer or anything, but feel free to give your best shot if you want to. It says, given that South Korean adoption has dropped off precipitously since the end of 1980s, do you have a sense that you are documenting a population which may disappear after the generations that were adopted through the 90s pass away, like a sense of documenting a population that may be extinct in the future?
I mean, again, I don't know that I'm super qualified to really say much, but I think that, adoption from South Korea is still happening. The latest numbers are, several hundred a year. And I think there's a focus on special needs cases, special needs adoptions. But, the fact is it is still happening. And, Korea is one of the, 15th largest, 13th, 15th largest economies in the world. It's quite wealthy, and yet international adoption, and yet it's still sending children overseas. And so, for it to actually end, I think that that's going to be a policy issue, and whether the government and whether there's, support with Korean citizens and understanding about what actually actually happens in adoption and how adult adoptees feel about not only just adoption, but just their experiences and the challenges they've gone through. And that's one of the reasons why I and the other podcasters here probably are motivated to keep going, is to tell accurate stories about adoption and from the adoptee's perspective, because I guarantee you all of us have grown up in with being told how we should feel about our adoptions or being adopted, and that grateful feeling. And I think that's one of my motivations, is to, have more people understand from our perspective, changing narratives. Podcasting isn't the only medium that adoptees are trying to change narratives, but I think it's also, it's quite effective. And I think there's something about audio too that is different from video. It's more intimate, and that's why I really love this medium, and I think why so many people are flocking to podcasts these days. But yeah, to that point, I think, and not only just the adoptees, there's also, I was messaging the other day with Korean American here in Minnesota, who's both of his parents are adoptees, but he is not. And so adoption continues to touch people, international adoption, where it's not only just the adoptee themselves, but it's their families, it's their children. I think that's a story left untold yet, about the children of adoptees and how adoption impacts them, identity, the need to connect back to their roots. Maybe this, I think adoptees all kind of live with this like black hole of our origin story, and questions kind of surround that. And then that still remains for one's kids. So, I think there's, in terms of adoptees being extinct, I think that there's still this, adoption is still seen as a very humanitarian and morally good thing to do. And so, I don't see adoption ending from South Korea soon.
Right. We have another question from Alicia Petrolito, and I think mainly for Damon, but really to the panel, whoever wants to answer, is she wonders if in their podcast it happens to get political, tackling U.S. use of adoption. For example, Damon, if you've ever encountered or interviewed a U.S.-born adoptee who was then adopted abroad.
I don't think I have, honestly. But I'm never, like, every time I think I've heard it all, someone comes with a story, and I'm just like, I never could have guessed that was even possible. So I don't recall interviewing anyone who was born domestically in the United States and adopted into another country. I did interview a woman once who was, I'm going to say, transracially adopted in a way that I didn't expect. So typically when I think of transracial adoptions, I think of white parents adopting some child of color. And this woman was and forgive me, I'm not going to be politically correct. I'm just going to say white, black, because that's just how I talk. So don't think twice about it. So this is a white woman who was adopted into a Latino family, which I thought was fascinating. I never could have guessed that there were adoptees out there of that, family makeup. And I feel like there was at least one other one where I was just like, wow, that's kind of wild, But I also find that there's some interesting stories in the domestic ones. And this one isn't necessarily domestic, but I had a guy from Canada who was, he's a interracially black guy who was adopted into a white family way up in Canada, like in a lumber town. And he describes himself as like a big guy, 6 foot something, 200 something pounds. and he's like this big gigantic black guy in this, you know, white community of lumberjacks, you know, standing out like a sore thumb. I guess my point in raising him and other stories is there's so many interesting combinations of how adoptions come together,
for sure,
that you can't even sort of predict what you're going to get with at least some of the stories on my show. They're so varied and so fascinating. But no, I've not encountered anyone who was born domestically and adopted into another country. But now that you've said it, I'm sure somebody's going to see this video and be like, I'd like to tell my story.
Out.
So
reach out to
I'm
Damon
down to hear it.
Is there any how was the political activism around domestic adoption? And particular, I mean, obviously there's like some battles over original birth certificates and things like that, but in terms of the adoption itself, do you hear much about that? Have you had interviews around that?
Not necessarily around the political activism around adoption. What I hear is more opinions from folks in Facebook groups and things like that. And it's a spectrum. There are folks that are like, adoption should go away forever, and you should do every single thing you could possibly ever do to keep a child with a mother. And then there are folks who recognize that there will always be a child in need. It doesn't matter what their age is. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. There will come a day when a child might need an alternative home from the one they were born into, and there will be an adoption. It may be a kinship adoption where the child goes into their own family. It may be an adoption of some other type that takes them across the country or around the world. You just can't predict what's going to be needed. So there's never going to be a time when adoption goes away. I think that there are, I'm hopeful that we have left the baby scoop era where children were being taken and coerced from parents and moved into adoption basically for profit. I'm hopeful that we have moved away from some of the international issues that my colleagues on the panel here have talked about in terms of some of the laws that have made it such that people were, you know, throwing babies away, which is just, it's disgusting and it's horrible. But I'm hopeful that we're moving away from some of that stuff, and that the activism of adoptees, like everybody in this group, is going to rise up as one voice that's going to try to push those things away.
We're gonna try to go back to Alora and see if this will work.
Hi. Can you guys hear me better?
Yes, looking better.
Is it great? Hi. My name's Alora, and I'm a Chinese adoptee. I host my own I co-podcast with another adoptee from China called Reading Rainbow. It's spelled like books that we had to read in high school and why we had to read them. It's not in a lot in our conversations that we have, because
Looks like we're losing you again.
I'm gonna try turning off her video.
Okay. Maybe we get the voice.
Let's see if that'll help you, Laura. I'm turning off your video. Let's just do audio.
Yeah, did that help?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Start with Reading and podcast and.
Yes, I have a podcast called Reading Rainbow, and it's spelled like reading, but it's Reading. We have a Twitter at Read Not Read Pod. But the question that I have is for Kayomi. I know that you were a 2016 Fulbright Scholar, and during that time you created Adapted. And I actually just like yesterday sent off an application to be an English teacher in South Korea. But one of my questions was, like, what was it like creating something quote unquote under Fulbright? Like, did you face any pushback or like, you know, censorship or anything like that? Or did you feel like you could speak freely with the content that you were creating?
Yeah, Alora, good luck on your Fulbright application. Fulbright's
Thank you.
a great vehicle and program. No, I mean, Fulbright, when you get a research, I was classified technically as a researcher. They're pretty hands off with your project. Basically, the big challenge is to get your project approved, and it has to go through in the US, a domestic panel. And if it passes the domestic vetting, then it goes to South Korea, and they have a Fulbright South Korean panel. And folks there have to judge your project, whether it has merits to support it. And also, if you can, they're really looking for people who can do it quite independently. And so they really don't provide a lot of support once you're in country, or really, I didn't receive very much feedback at all. I gave, really, it was working on my podcast, doing some other reporting, and then submitting sort of a midterm report. And then at the end, there was the year-end report, and that's it. So, I think, it's a great program because you get the funding if you're going to continue podcasting or whatever your project may be. And so that was a great vehicle for me. And one thing I'll say, to touch back on the funding part, so that was funded, and to get that going. And then after I returned back to the US, it was basically out of pocket. I had a lot of the equipment already, and so I just continued it. And, at some point, I thought, and one thing that I was really sensitive to is, adoptee stories. People become very vulnerable to share, and, how do you monetize that? It just didn't seem right. And, but over time, I came to realize that, these stories mean something to people, and they really impact folks. I get letters all the time or emails all the time about, they don't know another adoptee and they stumbled upon the podcast, and it's had a huge impact on them. And so I realized I want to keep it going, but it would be great if I had some help with some of the expenses to keep it going. And so that's what I've settled on now, is I do have a Patreon, and people contribute to that. And that's how I keep it going, where I take that money and I don't use it for personal, gain, but it goes into a fund that I use just for podcast expenses. And then of course I have the Kickstarter, which I talked about earlier. So yeah, I think Fulbright's a great vehicle if you want to apply for that and see if you can get that approved.
We have one final question before we wrap up. This is a question about, are any of the podcasters aware of a good podcast for adoptive parents on the impact that adoption has had on the adoptee? Obviously, all of your podcasts are good candidates, but maybe if you know of any that are maybe more targeted to adoptive parents, but still kind of trying to give insight into adoptee experiences.
So I'll start us off. I will say the short answer is no. But part of the reason for that is, by the time I get through the emotional roller coaster of talking to an adoptee about their journey, I can't listen to any more adoption stuff, like from another angle. I don't have the energy. I got to do other stuff with my life. So, but what I will say about my show, and what I suspect is likely true for the other shows, is when you listen to these folks openly emote about the things that they've been through, it's almost like if you're a parent, you ever been driving along and your kids are talking in the back, and it's almost like you're not even there, and you get to hear everything they're saying, and they will say everything under the sun as if you're not in the car. And that is a little bit like what listening to probably these adoptee podcasts are, is you're listening to someone openly express the things that are in their mind and in their heart. And you can't just like walk up to them and ask them that stuff. You've got to find it in a medium like what Kaomi, Amy, Maya, and Michael and you guys are presenting, is a place where people are going to openly speak that you can listen in. So I don't have any recommended resource in terms of in the terms of the specific question, but I think that each one of our podcasts do offer a similar inlet to what it is that you're looking for. And I'll say one more quick thing, Mike.
Please
On that
do.
last question I got, someone reached out to me in a direct message in the chat and raised her hand and said, I'm a domestically born person who was adopted out of the country. So I told you somebody was going to come forth immediately, and that's exactly what happened.
Looking forward to the episode in season 7.
I hope so.
All right, great. This is, I think, been a really great discussion. I just want to give each of you a chance to just maybe plug your Instagram account or whatever it is, just very quickly. And I'll also mention before we go that we do plan to post this recording up on YouTube. We'll put some of the show notes up, which will also include some of these Instagram handles, so you don't have to scribble and try to listen very, too carefully about it. But thanks again to all of our panelists. Let's just go around. Let's start with Kiyomi, if you want to just say any final comments and where people might reach you.
Sure. Yeah. Adopted Podcast. I have a website, adoptedpodcast.com. It's also, the podcast can be found wherever you get your podcasts. Also, the Instagram is adopted_podcast, and same with Twitter, although I'm not that active on Twitter for the podcast, but those are the best places to reach me. And of course, you can contact me through my website, adoptedpodcast.com.
Thanks. And Maya and Amy?
I'll do it, Maya. You can email us at somewhere.between.podcast@gmail.com, and our Instagram is at somewherebetween.fam. We do updates, casting calls, and a lot more.
Okay.
I'll wrap
Damon.
us up. So again, I'm Damon Davis. My podcast is Who Am I Really? You can find me online at whoamireallypodcast.com. You can find the podcast anywhere you get your other podcasts. You can find the show on Twitter at WAI Really. You can also find it on Facebook, WAI Really. Instagram, same thing, WAI Really. And you can always look for the heart with the little missing piece. So I'm looking forward to hearing more stories from other adoptees of varied backgrounds and things like that. And thanks to all the panelists here. I learned so much from each one of you guys. I'm really thankful to have been included. So thanks so much for putting this together.
Thanks to all of you.
Yes, thank you for putting this
Very
together.
glad to have you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again. Have
Take
a great
care,
night,
guys.
everybody.
Bye.